The wedding ring rested on the plate, shining in the light of the lamp that hung above the table. The metallic sound as it touched the porcelain made them both look up at the same time, first confused, then slowly terrified. They didn't need words to understand. She swallowed dryly, her fingers crisping on the tablecloth, while he looked away, as if he could hide from the magnitude of that moment. The silence was deafening, but inside me, everything was screaming. For weeks, maybe months, I had known. It wasn't just a feeling, it was the weight of the evidence, the excuses that piled up, the absences that seemed to last longer than necessary. Each night that I waited on the sofa while the clock ticked away seemed to erode a little more of what we had built. But I didn't say anything. I watched, ever more attentively. And when I finally knew, when I was sure, I didn't get angry, I didn't shout. I just planned. So that's it? I finally asked, breaking the silence that they clearly didn't know how to handle. Her lover lowered his eyes to his plate again, not daring to answer. She, on the other hand, tried to articulate something, but seemed unable to find words. You had no right, she began, but her voice failed her, and her eyes begged for some chance to explain. But there was nothing more she could say that I didn't already know. Every detail of that evening had been meticulously planned. The restaurant wasn't special to us, but it was discreet enough to avoid the glances of acquaintances. I invited them. Yes, myself, with an excuse so casual that it sounded almost innocent. A celebration, I said, for something I'd never mentioned. They accepted. Of course they accepted. Perhaps they thought I was a fool, or that this was some kind of trap that they could get around with smiles and well-rehearsed lies. They didn't know that the game was already lost. As I watched their reactions, the months of betrayal flashed through my mind like a cruel movie. I remembered the nights she was late, the deleted messages, the perfume that wasn't mine. I remembered every little detail, every moment when trust was eroded, drop by drop, until all that was left was mistrust. And there, in front of them, I felt something unexpected, relief. Finally, the whole farce was out in the open. The waiter approached to pour the wine, interrupting what could have been a protest on her part. Anything else? He asked, oblivious to the drama unfolding. I just shook my head. I think we already have everything we need, I replied, my voice so controlled that I was surprised. He left, and silence enveloped us again. Did you know? She finally asked, her voice low, hesitant, as if she was afraid of the answer. Yes, I answered simply. There was no need to elaborate. They knew enough, and what they didn't know would soon be clarified. She began to cry. Genuine tears or tears of superficial regret. I didn't know. It didn't matter anymore. I didn't want it to be like this, she mumbled, the words falling like stones into an empty well. Like what? I retorted, my tone now colder. How exactly did you want it to be? That I'd never find out. That you could go on living two lives, while I got the leftovers. He tried to speak then, perhaps to defend her or himself. It's not her fault, we didn't plan it, the words sounded weak, like cheap excuses that even he didn't believe. I stared at him, my eyes locked on his, and he turned away again. Plan or not, you knew she was married. You knew what that meant. And yet, here we are. She tried to pull herself together, wiping away the tears with the cloth napkin. I made a mistake, I know that. But we can fix it, we can, cut through the lies, rebuild trust. I interrupted, my voice finally carrying a tone of exhaustion that I hadn't shown before. Do you think you can glue together the shards of something you yourself smashed on the floor? She fell silent again, and her lover looked smaller and smaller in the chair next to her. Perhaps they expected me to explode, to start a public scene that would give them a dramatic exit. But I wouldn't give them that. I've made my answer very clear, she finally said, pointing to her plate. That wedding ring is the only thing left over from our marriage. And now, it's where it should be, out in the open, with no hiding places, just like you. I stood up and straightened my jacket, but not before taking one last look at her. You wanted a different ending. Here it is. But remember, endings are just new beginnings in disguise. And with that, I turned my back and walked out, leaving them to face the consequences of their own actions. But what they didn't know, and what no one could have predicted, was that that simple gesture, that wedding ring placed on a plate, would only be the start of something much bigger. Because, in the end, betrayals always take their toll, and the cost is never as simple as it seems. And that's how it all began. Their downfall. And, for me, something I never expected, freedom. Welcome to the channel where stories of betrayal come to life to show the devastating impact they can have. Here, we do not and will never support any kind of infidelity. Our stories are fictional, but they carry a real message. Betrayal doesn't just hurt, it destroys lives and relationships. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and deep lessons. Now, put on your headphones and take a deep breath. You're about to hear a shocking story that will stay with you for a long time. Happy listening. The restaurant chosen by Ethan for that special evening had a discreet, almost intimate charm. The yellowish light of the lamps created a cozy atmosphere, where each table seemed isolated in its own little universe. It was exactly what he was looking for, a place where he could have a meaningful moment without outside distractions. The evening promised something memorable, but as he watched the ring on his finger, turning it with his thumb, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Ethan was a methodical man, with a look that always seemed to measure the weight of every word and gesture. He was never given to impulses, every decision, no matter how small, was carefully planned. This made him excellent at his job, a management position that required strategic thinking, but it also gave his personal life an air of predictability. This stability, however, had always been a quality admired by his wife, Claire. Or so he believed. Claire, on the other hand, was the essence of spontaneity. Her laughter echoed easily and her energy seemed to light up any room. She had the gift of making Ethan, so serious and focused, forget for a moment the burdens of the world. When they met, while still at university, it was this contrast that brought them together. He, structured and calculating. She, uncomplicated and vibrant. Together, they built a life that seemed harmonious, with days filled with simple but meaningful moments. That evening, as they waited for dinner, Ethan felt a knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. He looked at Claire, who was smiling distractedly as she examined the menu. Her eyes shone with the same intensity he remembered from the beginning of their relationship. It was as if she still carried with her the same freshness as years ago, but something subtly different had emanated from her recently. He tried not to get carried away by assumptions, but there was something that unsettled him. A silent absence, a distance he couldn't name, but which seemed to grow like an invisible shadow. "Is everything all right?" asked Claire, tilting her head to the side, her eyes searching his. The tone of concern was genuine, but Ethan knew it wasn't easy for her to pick up on his emotions. He had become good at masking his thoughts, especially when he felt it wasn't safe to expose them. "Yeah, sure. Just thinking about work," he replied with a small but convincing smile. He didn't want to spoil the evening with his inner worries. While the dishes were being served, Claire began to tell him about a new project in her company. She was an interior designer and spoke enthusiastically about a client who wanted to transform an old mansion into something contemporary, while preserving its classic essence. Ethan listened attentively, absorbing every detail as he always did, but his mind oscillated between the present and fragmented memories. He remembered the beginning of it all. The impulsive trips they'd taken before settling down, the nights they'd planned their future together while sharing a bottle of cheap wine in their small apartment. He was fascinated by the way Claire saw the world. For her, everything had the potential to be beautiful, a trait that was reflected in both her work and her way of dealing with people. Over time, however, life brought its inevitable responsibilities. The routine of marriage, the pressures of work, social commitments, everything seemed to create a layer of conformity that, without realizing it, took them away from who they were when they fell in love. But it wasn't just routine. Something else had crept in between them, something Ethan couldn't define. A subtle but constant distancing. There were no fights, not even frequent disagreements, but a growing silence at times when conversations used to flow naturally. It was as if Claire's vibrant energy, which had attracted him so much, was now directed to places he couldn't reach. "Did you hear what I said?" Claire's voice brought him back to the present moment. He blinked, realizing that he had been lost in his own thoughts. "Yes, of course. The client wants to keep the essence of the mansion," he replied quickly, but she frowned, noticing his distraction. "You seem distant lately," she said, almost casually, but there was something in the way she spoke that indicated that this worried her more than she let on. "Sorry," he replied, reaching out to touch her hand on the table. "Work has been intense, but I promise I'll make an effort to be more present." She smiled, squeezing his hand lightly. It was a small gesture, but loaded with meaning. For Ethan, it was a relief to realize that, at least at that moment, they could still connect. As dinner progressed, the restaurant began to fill up, but the couple seemed isolated in their private bubble. Ethan watched Claire, mentally capturing the details that made him love her, the way she gestured when she spoke, the sound of her laughter, even the absent-minded way she played with the rim of her wine glass. He wanted to believe that there was still time to recover what they had lost, but the weight of doubt remained. When they had finished dessert, Claire suggested that they take a walk before heading home. It was a clear night, and the fresh air helped to dissipate some of the tension Ethan was carrying. As they walked side by side, he felt a deep desire to talk about his worries, to make room for an honest conversation, but the words wouldn't come. He knew that, once said, there would be no turning back. In the comfortable silence of that walk, Ethan realized that, despite all the happy moments they shared, there was an invisible barrier between them. Something he feared discovering and, at the same time, knew was inevitable. And, without knowing it, that night would be the starting point for a series of revelations that would change everything. Dawn brought the diffused light of a new day, but in Ethan and Claire's house, the shadows of silence seemed denser than ever. Ethan left for work early, as usual, but his thoughts were far from reports or meetings. There was something about Claire over the last few days that he couldn't decipher. It wasn't just distraction, it was the feeling that she was there, but her mind and heart were elsewhere. He wasn't sure when it had started, but now it seemed inescapable. Claire, meanwhile, remained at home, preparing for another day's work. Her hands glided over the fabrics she was examining for a new project, but her mind wandered down paths she didn't want to take. Evenings with Ethan had become a kind of empty ritual. She missed something she couldn't name, but which seemed to fill every gap in her thoughts. She wanted to believe that it was just a phase, but at the same time, she knew it wasn't that simple. During the day, Ethan tried to concentrate on his tasks, but the restlessness grew like a wave that he couldn't contain. Over the months, he had noticed changes in Claire that weren't just explained by tiredness or the pressures of work. It was the way she hesitated when answering simple questions, as if weighing up each word before saying it. Or the way she avoided his eyes at crucial moments, leaving a feeling of disconnection in the air. He looked through a pile of papers on his desk, but everything seemed unimportant. As the clock ticked down, Ethan drove home, but instead of going straight to the garage, he parked in the next block. He sat in the car for long minutes, the engine switched off, watching the light from the balcony of his house. Something inside him told him that, right now, it was better to watch from afar. Claire was inside the house, the soft sound of music filling the empty spaces. She checked her cell phone frequently, as if waiting for something. Finally, it rang. A brief smile crossed her face, and she quickly answered the message. It wasn't long before she picked up her bag and left, closing the door carefully. Ethan watched as she got into her car and drove off. His heart began to beat faster, a mixture of apprehension and resignation. He knew he should go home, but he couldn't. Instead, he followed Claire's car. She drove through streets that Ethan knew well, but which, at that moment, seemed foreign. The destination was a small cafe tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city. He parked a safe distance away and watched as Claire walked in, her shoulders tense but her face lit up with an expression he hadn't seen in ages. What came next made Ethan's stomach turn. A man stood up from a table in the corner and opened his arms to her. They hugged, the kind of hug that says more than words ever could. Ethan remained in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The world seemed to slow down around him, as if everything else lost relevance in the face of what he was witnessing. He wanted to go in, confront them, demand answers, but something held him back. It was the desire to know more, to understand what was happening before acting. In the cafe, Claire seemed relaxed, more so than she had been in weeks. She and the man were laughing and talking in low tones, as if they were sharing a precious secret. The sight of this was like a blow to Ethan. He had never imagined that she could have such a twinkle in her eye for someone else. He looked away for a moment, trying to pull himself together, but he couldn't shake the image. When they left, Ethan stayed at a safe distance, following them to a hotel. He parked again and waited. Time seemed to stretch out, each minute heavier than the last. Finally, they reappeared, but this time, something in Claire's posture was different. She looked hesitant, almost guilty. The man, on the other hand, displayed a confidence that made Ethan's blood boil. Ethan followed them until the man dropped her off at home. He waited until the car disappeared and then went inside. Claire was in the kitchen, pretending to prepare dinner, but her expression betrayed her. Ethan knew that this was the moment to confront her, but instead he decided to wait longer. He wanted to be sure of everything before laying his cards on the table. Over the next few days, Ethan dedicated himself to observing. He didn't mention anything about what he saw, but he began to put the pieces together. The messages on Claire's cell phone, her excuses for going out, the changes in her behavior, everything now made sense. Each discovery was like a knife plunging deeper, but it also gave him more clarity. Finally, one evening, when Claire seemed distracted, Ethan spoke up. "Is there something you want to tell me?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he knew. Claire hesitated, her face a mask of confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, but there was a tremor in her voice. "You know exactly what I mean," he replied, his voice low but firm. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Claire opened her mouth to reply, but closed it again. She knew he knew. Ethan needed no further confirmation. The look in her eyes said it all. He stood up, the air between them charged with tension. "I hope it's worth it," he said, before leaving and slamming the door. That night, while Claire sat at the table, staring into the void, Ethan drove aimlessly, trying to process the avalanche of emotions. Betrayal was now a certainty, but what he would do with it was yet to be decided. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there was more to be discovered. And what came next would be decisive for both of them. The night was silent, but inside Ethan's head, a storm was roaring. He had spent the day trying to act as if nothing had changed, but every time he looked at Claire, it was as if a weight was crushing his chest. Now, sitting in the living room, he waited. The clock struck 10 and Claire still hadn't returned from a meeting at work. Ethan knew exactly where she was, and with whom. He knew because he had followed her footsteps for the last few days, every detail etched into his mind like a burning scar. When the door finally opened, the sound echoed through the house. Claire entered, carrying a small bag, her steps hesitant as if she felt the weight of Ethan's gaze before she even saw him. He was sitting on the sofa, motionless, his hands intertwined on his knees. She stopped in the doorway, her breathing quickening as she realized he was waiting for her. "You're late," he said, without raising his head. His voice was low, but every word sounded sharp. "Yes, I got stuck in traffic," she replied, the excuse coming out of her mouth so mechanically that even she noticed the emptiness in her own voice. Ethan finally looked up. His eyes pierced her, searching for something beyond words. She hesitated, as if trying to decide what to say next, but he interrupted her. "You can stop lying," he said, with frightening calm. "I know." The silence that followed was so intense that it seemed to suffocate them. Claire opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She knew there was no escape. "Ethan," she began, but he held up his hand, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear excuses or half-truths," he said, his voice taking on a firmer tone. "I want to hear from you. I want to hear you admit it." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather her strength. "I made a mistake," she finally said, the words coming out in a whisper. "But that doesn't mean I don't love you." Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh, only bitterness. "Love? Do you think what you've done can coexist with love? Tell me, Claire, how do you define love? Because for me, love doesn't include betrayal." She fell silent, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't want it to happen," she said. "It was something that got out of hand." "Out of control," he repeated, as if savoring the irony of the phrase. "How many times have you lost control, Claire? Once? 2 times? Or so many that you can't even count?" Claire took a step forward, trying to get closer to him, but he backed away, standing up. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice laden with pain. "You destroyed something I thought was unshakable. And now you want me to just accept it?" "Ethan, please listen to me," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I know I made a mistake, but that doesn't change everything we've built together. We can still fix it." "Fix it?" he asked incredulously. "Do you think this is like breaking a plate? Just sticking the pieces together and pretending nothing happened?" Silence fell between them again, but this time it was Claire who interrupted him. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "You were so distant, so focused on other things. I felt invisible." "Invisible," he repeated, anger boiling beneath the surface. "You felt invisible, so you decided to make yourself visible to another man? Is that it?" "It's not that simple," she replied, desperately trying to justify herself. "I lost myself, Ethan. I made a terrible mistake, but that doesn't mean we can't get over it together." He shook his head, as if trying to take his words away from her. "Do you think this is something I can just get over? That I can forget what I saw, what I felt, what you did?" Claire fell silent again, but this time it was Ethan who broke it. "I saw you," he said, the words coming out like a blow. "I followed you, Claire. I saw you with him. I saw everything." She gasped, shock evident on her face. "Ethan, no," he interrupted her. "Now you're going to listen to me. I saw you hug him as if he were the center of your world. I saw the smile you kept for me. And I saw the place where you met, the hotel where you threw away everything we had." Claire fell to the floor, tears brimming. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression full of pain and disbelief. "Do you think apologies are enough?" he asked. "You destroyed something that can never be rebuilt. And now you want me to just forgive?" She tried to approach him again, but he took a step back, as if he were running away from an abyss. "I don't know if I can look at you without remembering all this," he said. "And, frankly, I don't know if I want to try." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the sound of Claire's irregular breathing. Ethan picked up his keys and walked to the door, but before he left, he stopped. "I left something for you on the living room table," he said, his voice now cold and distant. "Something that sums up how I feel about all this." She stood there, alone, as he left, the tears continuing to flow. When she finally found the strength to get up, Claire went into the living room. On the table, a small envelope awaited her. Inside was a single sheet of paper and something she recognized immediately, the wedding ring Ethan had taken off her finger. The paper bore just one sentence: "You chose to destroy. Now I choose to rebuild, but without you." The words pierced her heart like a knife. She knew that this was the final consequence of her actions. And, for the first time, she realized how irreparable was the damage she had caused. Ethan drove aimlessly, his hands firmly on the wheel, but his mind in chaos. The muffled sound of the engine was the only noise that accompanied him, while his emotions oscillated between anger, despair and something he still couldn't name. He needed air, space, but above all clarity. Claire's words echoed in his head, but they sounded empty, as if they were no longer able to reach his heart. He parked in a deserted street and stood there, staring into nothingness, as the weight of the moment pulled him into an abyss. Back at the house, Claire couldn't sit still. She wandered through the rooms like a shadow, her eyes swollen from crying. Her wedding ring rested on the table as a cruel reminder of what she had destroyed. She knew she had gone too far, but for the first time she was facing the naked reality of her choices. She picked up the phone several times, but couldn't muster the courage to call Ethan. His silence was deafening, and his absence only amplified her guilt. Hours later, Ethan returned. The door opened slowly, and the sound echoed through the house like thunder. Claire, who was sitting on the sofa, got up hurriedly, but stopped when she saw his face. There was something different about Ethan, a cold determination that frightened her. He closed the door behind him and was silent for a long moment, just staring at her. "You're still here," he finally said, his voice low but loaded with meaning. Claire took a step forward, but stopped when she realized he wasn't moving. "Ethan, please, we need to talk." "Talk?" He laughed dryly, but there was no humor in his tone. "You had every opportunity in the world to talk. But you chose to do that." "I made a mistake," she said quickly, her voice shaking. "I know there's no justification, but, there is no justification," he interrupted, his tone sharp as a blade. "Nothing you say now will change what happened. But I want to understand something, Claire. Why? Why did you do it?" She hesitated, her hands shaking as she tried to find the right words. "I felt alone," she began, but Ethan's expression made her stop. "Alone," he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "I was here. I've always been here. Maybe not in the way you wanted, but I was here. And that wasn't enough for you?" "It's not that simple," she said, her voice almost inaudible. "I was lost, Ethan. And then, he appeared. He made me feel alive again." Her words hit Ethan like a blow. He turned away for a moment, rubbing his face with his hands, trying to contain the wave of anger that threatened to overflow. "Hey," he repeated, almost as if he were talking to himself. "And what has that done to me, Claire? Have you ever thought about how I felt while you were living?" "I know I hurt you," she said, the tears starting to roll again. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but please, please don't give up on us." "Don't give up on us," he repeated, turning to face her again. "You gave up on us first, Claire. You threw everything we had away. For what? For something that was never real." "It was real for me," she said, and the words hung in the air like poison. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Then choose," he said, each word charged with intensity. "Choose now. Because I'm not waiting any longer. It's either me, or it's him." Claire was silent, her eyes wide as she processed the ultimatum. She knew there was no real choice to be made, but the question confronted her with the truth she was trying to avoid. "I choose you," she finally said, but the hesitation in her voice betrayed her. Ethan gave a small smile, but there was no joy in it. "You choose because now you have no other option. But tell me, Claire, if I hadn't found out, would you still be choosing him?" She couldn't answer. The word seemed stuck in her throat, and the silence spoke louder than anything she could say. Ethan shook his head, as if her answer didn't surprise him, but still hurt him. "I'm leaving," he said, finally breaking the silence. "I'll give you the space you clearly need to reflect on your choices." "Please, Ethan, don't go," she begged, but he was already heading for the door. He stopped with his hand on the doorknob, turning to look at her one last time. "You destroyed what we had, Claire. But what hurts most isn't that. It's realizing that I was never enough for you." With that, he left, leaving Claire alone with the weight of his words and the consequences of his actions. The door slammed shut, and the sound resounded through the house, marking the end of something she knew would never be the same again. Ethan drove again, but this time he wasn't aimless. He knew exactly where he needed to go. The name of a lawyer a friend had recommended popped into his mind, and he decided it was time to start taking charge of the situation. While Claire dealt with her guilt, Ethan was determined to rebuild his life, even if it meant leaving everything behind. Claire sat in the room for hours, staring into the void. Her mind was a whirlwind of regret and panic. She knew she had lost more than just Ethan's trust. She had lost a part of herself that would never be recovered. But she also knew that she couldn't give up without a fight. Not now. Not after everything. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed his number. The call went to voicemail, but she left a message anyway. "Ethan, I know I made a mistake. I know you have no reason to listen to me, but please give me a chance. I'm going to prove to you that we can still be us." On the other end of the line, Ethan listened to the message, but didn't reply. He knew that what came next would be difficult, but he was prepared. And this time, he knew he would no longer be bound by Claire's choices. He was finally ready to choose himself. Dawn brought a cold, indifferent light through the curtains of Claire's house. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of cold coffee. The night before replayed in her mind like a broken record, Ethan's every word echoing in a torturous cycle. He had gone, leaving her alone with her guilt and the fragments of a relationship that she herself had destroyed. The silence in the house seemed more deafening than any argument they could have had. Meanwhile, Ethan had found temporary refuge in a small hotel outside the city. He woke up early, even though he had barely slept a wink. His mind was still flooded with flashes of the previous night's conversation, but now a different feeling was beginning to emerge. It wasn't exactly relief, but something close to it, as if he could finally breathe without the weight of constant doubt crushing his chest. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was in control. Claire, unable to bear the weight of inertia, decided to act. She picked up the phone and, after hesitating for long minutes, dialed the number of a therapist she had considered seeing months ago, when she had started to feel disconnected from Ethan. Back then, she had given up, thinking she could handle everything on her own. Now, the need to face up to her own mistakes seemed inescapable. She made the appointment for the same day, hoping that this would be the first step in trying to rebuild something, even if it was just herself. While Claire was taking the first steps towards dealing with the consequences of her choices, Ethan was heading in a different direction, but with the same goal of rebuilding. He had already made an appointment with the lawyer indicated by his friend. The meeting was direct and to the point. Ethan explained the situation, without trying to smooth over the details or protect Claire. He didn't feel any hatred, but there was a firmness in his words that showed his determination to move forward. "Divorces are never easy," said the lawyer, leaning back in his chair as he reviewed his notes. "But with the evidence you have, things can be quicker. Have you decided what you want to do with the house?" Ethan hesitated for a moment. The house was more than just a piece of real estate, it was the place where he and Claire had built a life, shared memories that, despite everything, still carried value. But now, that place seemed tainted, a constant reminder of betrayal. "I see," he said at last. "I don't want anything to tie me to that." As the lawyer detailed the next steps, Ethan felt a mixture of sadness and resolution. Each decision brought him closer to a future that he still couldn't fully visualize, but that he knew was necessary. Later that day, Claire arrived at the therapist's office. The room was cozy, with soft lights and comfortable armchairs, but none of this made her feel at ease. She sat down, her hands clasped in her lap, as she tried to find the right words to start with. "I destroyed my marriage," she finally said, her voice breaking. "And now, I don't even know who I am." The therapist listened attentively, encouraging her to explore the feelings that had brought her to this point. For the first time, Claire spoke openly about the loneliness she had felt, the insecurities that had consumed her and, finally, the choices that had brought everything crashing down. The words flowed like a broken dam, and by the end of the session, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced for a long time, even if she was still far from finding answers. Ethan, on the other hand, spent the rest of the day immersed in work, trying to avoid thinking too much. But late in the afternoon, when he finally returned to the hotel, he found himself looking at his phone. He saw several messages from Claire, all unread. He was tempted to delete them without opening them, but something inside him stopped him. He read the messages, one after the other, each laden with apologies, regrets and promises of change. He didn't reply. He didn't know if he wanted to reply. Part of him wanted to confront her again, to understand what had really driven her to destroy what they had. Another part knew that any further conversation would only prolong the pain. So he decided he needed some outside advice. She called her longtime friend, someone who had been by her side through other difficult times. "Do you think I should listen to her?" asked Ethan, after recounting the events of the last few weeks. His friend was silent for a moment before answering. "The question isn't whether you should listen," he finally said. "It's whether you want to listen. Because, at the end of the day, this isn't about her, Ethan. It's about you. What do you need to move on?" The words resonated in Ethan, and he realized that he still didn't have that answer. But he knew that, whatever the path, he would be the one to decide. In the days that followed, both Ethan and Claire faced the echoes of the destruction of their marriage in different ways. Claire continued her therapy, trying to understand the parts of herself that had led to her betrayal. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she hoped to find a way to deal with it. Ethan, on the other hand, focused on creating a new beginning. He started looking for an apartment, something small but comfortable, where he could start again without the shadows of the past. Eventually, their paths crossed again. Claire asked to meet him and, against his initial instinct, Ethan accepted. The meeting took place in a cafe, a neutral place, far from any memory of what they had been. "I'm not going to beg for your forgiveness," Claire began, her eyes fixed on his. "I just want you to know that I'm trying to change. Not for you, not for us, but because I have to. Because I can't go on being the person who did this to you." Ethan listened in silence, his hands folded on the table. "I believe you're sorry," he finally said. "But regret doesn't erase what happened. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you without remembering it." Claire nodded, tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. "I understand," she said. "I just wanted you to know that, despite everything, you were the best thing that ever happened in my life. And I'm sorry I didn't appreciate that when I had the chance." Ethan was silent for a moment before standing up. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Claire," he said. "But I need to find my own peace now." He left the cafe, leaving Claire alone once again. But this time, she didn't feel the overwhelming despair she had felt before. She felt something different, acceptance. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to face it. As Ethan walked to his car, he felt a weight being lifted. There was still pain, of course, but there was also something else, a spark of hope, that, despite everything, he could rebuild his life. And, for the first time, he was willing to try. Ethan felt the morning sun on his face as he opened the window of his new apartment. The fresh air and silence of the place were an absolute contrast to the whirlwind of emotions he had been facing over the last few weeks. He still wasn't completely at peace, but each day brought another step towards it. He had sold the house, ended the most painful phase of the divorce and started to shape a new life, one that didn't depend on Claire or any memories she carried. However, that didn't mean that the wounds were healed. He knew that the scar would remain, but he also knew that it was a part of his history that he would need to carry. Claire, on the other hand, was on a very different path. The sale of the house had been a final blow to everything she knew, and every piece of furniture packed away felt like a reminder of what she had lost. Even so, she continued to attend therapy sessions, trying to understand her choices and the reasons that had led her to betray the only person who had really believed in her. The emptiness she felt now was different. It was no longer the absence of Ethan by her side, but the lack of something within herself. And, for the first time, she was willing to face it. Claire's lover, who had been the catalyst for all the destruction, was also facing the consequences of his actions. The revelation of his connection to Claire did not go unnoticed in the social circle they shared. The opportunities that had once seemed so promising began to evaporate, and he realized that the charm he had used to manipulate situations was now useless in the face of his ruined reputation. Without Claire's support and with the silent contempt of those around him, he found himself more isolated than ever. For Ethan, the new beginning didn't come without its challenges. At work, he threw himself into new projects, finding a focus he had long lost. But it was on an ordinary afternoon in a corner bookshop that he encountered something he had never expected, a different look, a presence that made him feel something he thought he had lost forever. Her name was Olivia, and there was something about her calmness and sincerity that disarmed him. It wasn't an immediate connection, but a conversation that grew little by little, with the naturalness of something that didn't need to be rushed. Over time, Ethan realized that Olivia wasn't just a relief from the pain he carried, but a reminder that true love doesn't have to be grandiose or dramatic, just honest. She didn't try to fix him or erase his past, but stood by him as he rebuilt his life. And, little by little, he realized that maybe there was room in his heart to start again. Claire, on the other hand, was still struggling with the shadows of the past. She had moved into a small apartment and found a job that kept her busy. But regret was still with her, a silent companion that never let her forget the choices she had made. One winter afternoon, while organizing some old papers, she found a photo of her and Ethan, taken during a trip they had taken years ago. Their smiles were carefree, full of love and hope. She cried, not for his loss, but for the woman she had been then and no longer recognized. It was also during this time that Claire had the courage to send one last message to Ethan. She didn't expect a reply, she knew he was moving on. But she felt the need to say something that was perhaps more for herself than for him. I just wanted to say that I'm really, really sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be a better person. I hope you find the happiness you deserve. Ethan read the message late at night, sitting in his favorite armchair. He didn't reply. Not because he held a grudge, but because he felt there was nothing more to be said. Claire's message didn't upset him as he had feared, instead, it confirmed something he already knew, he had moved on. Months later, Ethan and Olivia walked together in a park, their conversations flowing with the lightness of someone who no longer carries unnecessary weight. He didn't tell her all the details of his past, but enough for her to understand that he was learning to trust again. And, for the first time in a long time, he felt that life was not just something to be endured, but lived. Claire continued her journey, not in search of redemption, but of self-understanding. She knew that Ethan would never come back, and she finally accepted that. One sunny morning, as she walked through the city, she felt something she hadn't experienced for a long time, a spark of hope. She knew that the road ahead would be lonely, but no longer empty. She had decided that, even if she could never repair the mistakes of the past, she could still build something different for the future. As for her lover, he disappeared from their radar, a distant memory of a choice that brought ruin to everyone involved. He went his own way, but what he found in him was something that would never matter to Ethan or Claire again. And so the fragments of a story marked by pain, betrayal and difficult choices found their places. Ethan found a new love, Claire found a new purpose and, somehow, they both learned that the past can't be erased, but it doesn't have to define who they will be in the future. If you've made it this far, let us know in the comments what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important, and we want to know how it impacted you. And remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. These stories are fictional and exist to show how infidelity can destroy lives and relationships. Subscribe for more stories like this and get ready for even more intense emotions in the next ones.